My in-laws mocked me for bringing budget wine to dinner, so I bought the Vineyard and sent them a free bottle with a note that said, "Cheers." I'm a 32-year-old woman, and I've always tried my best to fit in with my husband's family. From the very first dinner at his parents' house, I could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on me like a storm cloud. I wanted to make a good impression, so I brought a bottle of wine I could actually afford, something I thought was thoughtful, not flashy. The moment I handed it over, the room went quiet for a second. Then, one of my mother-in-law's eyebrows shot up. "Oh, that's interesting," she said with that thinly veiled smirk I now recognize as her signature. My father-in-law chuckled, a soft, dismissive laugh like I had just tried to hand them tap water and called it champagne. My husband shot me a nervous glance, squeezing my hand under the table, but it didn't help the sinking feeling in my stomach. I sat there, trying to smile, trying to make a joke, anything to diffuse the tension, but the barbs kept coming. "You picked that yourself?" One cousin whispered loud enough for the table to hear. Another chimed in with a fake gasp. "Well, budget wine, really? That's ambitious." I felt my cheeks burning, my hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly it left marks. I wanted to shrink into the floor, disappear, anything to escape their silent judgment and loud whispers. It was supposed to be a casual, friendly dinner. Instead, it felt like a gauntlet, and I had tripped at the first hurdle. I kept replaying it in my mind long after dinner, every laugh, every glance, every quiet whisper. I kept thinking maybe I wasn't good enough to be here. Maybe they'd never see me as anything more than cheap. But somewhere in that humiliation, a tiny spark lit inside me. A thought whispered, "One day they'll see me differently. One day they'll understand." And that's when I realized this wasn't just embarrassment. It was personal. Little did I know that one bottle of budget wine was about to set off a chain of events that would change everything. The next dinner at my in-laws' house felt like walking into a battlefield. Even before I could set my bag down, my mother-in-law shot me a look that screamed judgment, like she'd been waiting all week for me to mess up again. I tried to laugh it off, saying, "I thought this wine was fun." But her smirk didn't soften. "Oh, fun, sure," she replied, tilting her head like she was inspecting a bargain bin item. My father-in-law chuckled again, louder this time, and added, "I didn't know we were playing pretend sommelier tonight." My stomach dropped. The cousins exchanged glances and smothered snickers into their napkins. Every word felt like a dagger, cutting into a part of me I didn't even know was vulnerable. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to be polite, to prove I could play their game. I poured wine for everyone, careful to make it seem effortless, but even that simple act didn't save me. "You're holding it wrong," one of the cousins whispered. "You really should know how to pour properly." I felt my hands tremble, my confidence crumbling with every passing second. Inside, I was boiling with a mix of humiliation and anger. I wanted to scream, to throw the bottle across the room, to make them feel just a fraction of the embarrassment they were inflicting on me. But I stayed silent, forcing a tight-lipped smile while my cheeks burned red. It was the kind of shame that sticks with you, the kind that makes you question yourself, your worth, your place in their family. By the end of dinner, I felt smaller, like I had shrunk into the chair I was sitting in. The in-laws didn't even notice. They were too busy patting each other on the back for teaching me a lesson. My husband apologized quietly under his breath, squeezing my hand, but it couldn't erase the sting. Walking home that night, replaying every insult, every smirk, I realized this wasn't just casual teasing. This was personal. And I started thinking, maybe there was a way I could flip this. A way to turn this humiliation into something powerful. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the dinner in my head, the snickers, the side glances, my mother-in-law's smirk like she'd just scored a personal victory. Every memory of that table made my stomach knot, and I couldn't stop thinking about how powerless I felt. I had tried so hard to fit in, to be polite, to show I belonged, but somehow, none of it mattered. I walked through our tiny kitchen, staring at the bottle of wine we had brought, the one that had somehow become a symbol of my inadequacy. My mind raced. Was it really just about the wine? Or was it that they didn't see me as their equal? That they judged everything about me? from my tastes to my worth to my place in the family. I felt a mix of humiliation, anger, and a simmering determination I hadn't realized I possessed. I told my husband, "I don't get it. It's just wine. Why do they make me feel like a joke?" He sighed and wrapped his arms around me. "They're just them. Don't let them get inside your head." But the words barely reached me. Part of me wanted to vanish. Part of me wanted to show them that one day I wouldn't be someone they could belittle so easily. I started obsessing over ways to prove myself, not in a petty, angry way, but in a way that would make them realize I wasn't someone to dismiss. I imagined scenarios, little victories where their smirks would finally be silenced. I even laughed quietly to myself, thinking, what if one day they could never look down on me again? That night, staring out the window at the dark quiet of the street, I felt something awaken inside me, a determination fueled by humiliation. I didn't want revenge yet, not in the obvious way. I wanted something bigger, something that would make them realize their mockery had only pushed me to rise. I didn't know it then, but that tiny spark of frustration was about to grow into a plan that would change everything, and it all started with a single idea. A week later, I found myself scrolling through articles about vineyards, wineries, and boutique wine investments. At first, it was just idle curiosity, a distraction from replaying every cruel comment, every judgmental glance. But the more I read, the more an idea started to take shape. What if I could actually do this? I sat at our tiny dining table, laptop open, heart pounding. The numbers made sense, surprisingly so. There was a small vineyard for sale, not far from where we lived, with decent production and room to grow. My hands shook as I clicked through the listing photos. The rows of grapevines, the rustic barn, the old wine barrels. It felt impossible and yet plausible. I could feel the tiny spark inside me start to burn hotter. I imagined the day I could own something real, something tangible, something they would never expect. I pictured my mother-in-law's face when she learned I had turned a humiliation into a statement of success. My husband looked over my shoulder and raised an eyebrow. "Are you serious?" he asked, half concerned, half amused. "I think I am," I whispered almost to myself. The thought of doing it made my chest tighten with both fear and excitement. This wasn't petty revenge. This wasn't just about a bottle of cheap wine anymore. It was about proving that their mockery couldn't define me, that I could rise above it in a way they'd never see coming. That night, I stayed up late, researching vineyard finances, market potential, even tasting notes. Every piece of data, every article I read, made the plan more real. I didn't want to rush, but I knew I couldn't let the idea slip away. This was the first step toward reclaiming my dignity. Not with a tantrum, not with a scolding, but with quiet, unstoppable action. By the time the sun rose, I had made a decision. I was going to buy that vineyard, and I had no idea that the move I was about to make would shock everyone and change the balance of power in my family forever. A few weeks later, I found myself signing papers I never thought I'd sign in my life. The vineyard was officially mine. My hands shook as I held the contract, my heart hammering with a mix of fear, excitement, and vindication I hadn't felt before. Walking through those endless rows of grapevines, I could feel the air shift. It smelled like soil, sun, and possibility. Every step I took among the vines felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been mocked and belittled for so long. Inside the small, rustic barn, I traced my fingers along the old oak barrels, imagining the first harvest, imagining the wine that would come from these grapes. It was surreal, almost cinematic. The quiet hum of life around me, the birds overhead, the gentle creak of wood in the morning breeze. I could feel the power of this place sinking in. This wasn't just a business. This was my statement. I spent hours sketching out my plan in a notebook, down to the tiniest detail. How I would produce my wine, how I would brand it, and most importantly, how I would make sure my in-laws saw it in a way that would leave them speechless. My husband peeked over my shoulder, shaking his head with a grin. "You're ridiculous," he said, but his eyes sparkled with excitement. "I love it." By the end of the day, I knew exactly how I was going to do it. I would send them a single bottle, carefully curated, perfectly presented, with nothing but one word on the note: cheers. No explanations, no gloating. The mystery would do the talking. My mind raced with the possibilities of their reaction, the shock, the embarrassment, maybe even the awe. For the first time, humiliation felt like fuel. Every snicker, every eye roll from that first dinner was now a silent motivator, pushing me to create something tangible, impressive, and completely unexpected. I felt alive, unstoppable, and quietly satisfied. As I drove home that evening, Vineyard keys in hand, I realized I had crossed a line. I was no longer the person who had been mocked. I was about to make them realize it, whether they were ready or not. Over the next few weeks, I obsessed over every detail without anyone knowing. I bottled and labeled, tasted and retasted, refining everything until it felt perfect. Every time I held a bottle in my hands, I could almost hear their whispers from that first dinner, their mockery echoing in my mind. It fueled me, silently, methodically. I imagined their reactions repeatedly. My mother-in-law picking up the bottle, her eyes widening in disbelief. My father-in-law fumbling for words while my cousins tried to hide their envy. I smiled quietly to myself at the thought. This wasn't about revenge in a loud, messy way. It was about control, about showing them, without a single harsh word, that I had turned humiliation into power. At night, I'd sit in our tiny living room, notebook open, sketching ideas for the perfect note. One word, one gesture, enough to speak volumes without shouting. I imagined myself handing over the gift in person versus sending it anonymously, and realized the impact would be stronger if it was mysterious, almost untouchable. I wanted them to feel the weight of their own assumptions crashing back onto them. My husband watched me with a mixture of amusement and admiration. "You're enjoying this way too much," he said one evening. I shrugged, a small smile on my lips. "No," I admitted, "I'm finally enjoying myself." The humiliation that had plagued me for months was fading, replaced by something I hadn't expected: satisfaction. Quiet, controlled, and intoxicating. I knew one thing for certain: patience was key. They had underestimated me, and I was going to make them wait. That anticipation, that slow burn of uncertainty would make the reveal all the sweeter. Every day, every night, every secret sip and tasting of the wine reminded me that I was no longer powerless. And then came the day I finally decided it was time. Time to let them taste what they never expected. Time to let them see who I had truly become. The night before I sent the bottle, I found myself staring at the dark ceiling, feeling a strange mix of excitement and doubt. For months, I had poured every ounce of energy into this plan, and yet a tiny voice whispered, "Am I being petty? Is this really worth it?" I couldn't shake the memories of that first dinner. The snide remarks, the laughter behind my back, the way they made me feel like I didn't belong. The humiliation still stung, sharper in the quiet moments, the moments when no one was watching. I thought about how far I had come since that night. I wasn't the timid, anxious woman who had clutched her bottle like a shield anymore. I had taken control, built something tangible, something impressive from scratch. But still, the fear lingered. What if sending this bottle only made things worse? What if it backfired and painted me as petty, spiteful, or even ridiculous? I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a small glass of the wine I had created. The aroma hit me first. Earthy, rich, with a subtle sweetness that made my chest tighten. I swirled it, breathed it in, and tasted it slowly. Every sip reminded me of my journey. The humiliation, the late nights researching vineyards, the secret smiles as my vision started to come together. I realized that this was bigger than them. This was my triumph, my growth, my statement that I was no longer defined by their judgment. I even laughed quietly at myself, realizing how seriously I had taken their mockery for so long. It was absurd, but also perfectly human. I allowed myself a moment of vulnerability, acknowledging the pain, the anger, the embarrassment, but also the empowerment that had grown from it. By the time I placed the bottle in its box, with a simple note that read, "Cheers," I knew there was no turning back. The next day, they would finally see me, but I had no idea how they would react. The next morning, I dropped the package off at the doorstep, my hands trembling with anticipation. The label gleamed softly in the sunlight and the note inside was simple. Cheers. No explanations, no gloating, just a single word carrying months of silent effort, frustration, and vindication. As I walked away, I felt a strange mix of nerves and satisfaction. This was the moment my humiliation was finally turning into something powerful. Hours later, my husband called, barely able to keep his voice steady. They got it. "Mom just called. She's speechless." I laughed softly, trying to keep my composure. "Speechless how?" I asked. He hesitated, then whispered, "I think they're shocked, like really shocked. She keeps asking how it's possible." I imagined them opening the package. My mother-in-law holding the bottle delicately, her eyes widening in disbelief. My father-in-law fumbling with the note, trying to mask his astonishment. My cousins whispering among themselves, unsure whether to be impressed or embarrassed. Every imagined expression made me grin quietly to myself. For the first time, I felt the power dynamic shifting. The same family that had mocked my taste, my choices, my place at the table, was now confronted with undeniable proof of my capability, my ambition, and my success. It wasn't revenge in the cruel sense. They weren't humiliated publicly. But it was perfect. Silent, elegant, and undeniable. Even my husband could feel the weight of it. "You did it." "Quietly, completely on your terms," he said. I nodded, savoring the feeling. This was my statement, and they couldn't argue with it, no matter how much they wanted to. And yet, even in their shock, I could sense the tension simmering. This was only the beginning. Their next move would reveal just how deeply my actions had unsettled them. By the time dinner rolled around that evening, I could feel the tension in the air before I even stepped through the door. My mother-in-law greeted me with a tight smile, her eyes darting nervously toward the dining table. The bottle of wine sat in plain view on the counter, and I could practically feel the electric shock of their realization buzzing through the room. My father-in-law cleared his throat, awkwardly adjusting his chair as if trying to act casual while the truth of the situation sank in. I caught snippets of their hushed conversations. Did she really do this? And I can't believe she actually pulled this off. I sat quietly, smiling just enough to look innocent, while internally I was savoring every ounce of their discomfort. The cousins whispered and giggled, exchanging glances of envy and admiration, unsure whether to speak or just silently marvel at what had happened. Every word, every pause, every subtle glance from them reinforced the quiet shift in power. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and amusement as they tried to regain control of the conversation, throwing backhanded compliments that fell flat. "Well, impressive," my mother-in-law muttered, trying to maintain composure while her voice betrayed a hint of disbelief. My father-in-law added, "We didn't see this coming." I nodded politely, taking a sip from a glass I poured myself, feeling the tangible proof of my months of effort and planning. Inside, I reflected on the journey, the humiliation of that first dinner, the weeks of secret research and vineyard acquisition, the countless sleepless nights spent imagining this exact moment. It wasn't revenge in the dramatic, destructive sense, but it was victory, a statement that spoke louder than any confrontation could. Yet, even as I sat there, calm and composed, I could sense a subtle storm brewing. Their next words, their next actions, were impossible to predict, and I knew the real test of this power shift was still coming. The next dinner felt different. There was a quiet tension at the table, like a storm held just behind the clouds. My in-laws kept stealing glances at the wine bottle, their expressions a mixture of shock, admiration, and something I couldn't quite place, maybe guilt, maybe awe. I poured myself a glass, deliberately slow, and felt the satisfying weight of control settle over me. My mother-in-law finally spoke, her voice tight, carefully neutral. "I didn't expect this. You really did all of this yourself?" I nodded, sipping slowly. "Yes," I said simply, letting the words linger. It wasn't meant to humiliate. It was meant to show that the person they'd underestimated for months had grown stronger, smarter, and entirely untouchable by their old judgments. My father-in-law shifted in his seat, forcing a small, awkward smile. We underestimated you, he admitted, though it sounded more like a recognition of defeat than praise. I just smiled politely, calm and collected. I didn't need to gloat. They were already learning the lesson. The quiet shift in the room spoke louder than any words ever could. I had claimed my power, and it was undeniable. I could see the cousins whispering, trying to mask their envy while secretly impressed. I felt a strange wave of satisfaction. Not revenge, not malice, but pure, quiet triumph. The same people who had mocked me for something as small as a bottle of wine were now aware of the depth of my ambition and capability. Even as the conversation moved on, I knew the ripple effect of this evening was just beginning. The real impact of what I had done would unfold in ways none of us could yet predict. A few weeks later, the true twist revealed itself. The Vineyard's first batch had been submitted to a local competition, and to my quiet delight and absolute surprise, the wine had won an award. Not just any recognition, but one that the local community respected, the kind that made people sit up and take notice. I watched, amused and proud, as my mother-in-law casually served my award-winning wine at a family gathering, completely unaware of who had actually created it. I stayed quiet, sipping my glass, enjoying every second of their stunned faces. The whispers began. "Where did this come from?" And "I didn't know she was capable of this." Every compliment that passed their lips felt like a tiny victory, and I allowed myself a private, quiet smile. They thought they were hosting a normal dinner, celebrating a fine wine, but they were unknowingly celebrating my success. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very people who had laughed at my choice of budget wine were now unknowingly praising the product of my dedication, creativity, and patience. It was the perfect, quiet revenge. Not loud, not petty, but undeniably satisfying. I had turned humiliation into triumph without ever needing to confront them directly. I reflected on the journey, the sting of that first dinner, the long nights researching vineyards, the careful planning, and the months of patient anticipation. Every moment of doubt, every pang of embarrassment had fueled me to reach this point. The power had shifted subtly but completely. I had grown beyond their judgment, beyond their mockery, and in doing so, I had reclaimed my self-worth. And yet, as I poured another glass, I realized the true victory wasn't the award or the recognition. It was the knowledge that I had transformed pain into something beautiful, something permanent, and something they could never take away. Months later, the dynamic at family dinners had changed entirely. My in-laws were more cautious now, less quick to judge, and often glancing at me with a mix of respect and disbelief. The bottle of wine that had once been a symbol of my humiliation had become a quiet testament to my growth, patience, and resilience. I no longer felt anxious or second-guessed. I had claimed my space, and they knew it. I watched my mother-in-law pour a glass for a guest, smiling politely at me, her usual smirk replaced by something more neutral. Curiosity, perhaps even admiration. My father-in-law made a small comment about how impressive the vineyard had turned out, and for the first time, I accepted it without feeling the need to explain or justify myself. The quiet power I held wasn't loud or brash. It was steady, undeniable, and deeply satisfying. I thought back to the nights I had spent worrying, obsessing over their judgment, and feeling small. Every ounce of pain had been redirected into something tangible, something that proved my worth, not just to them, but to myself. I realized that the ultimate triumph had never been about proving a point to anyone else. It was about proving to myself that I could rise above humiliation, take control, and create something extraordinary from it. Even my husband noticed the change in me. "You've really become unstoppable," he said one evening, raising his glass. I smiled, feeling the warmth of empowerment settle over me. The wine had been a symbol, yes, but what it represented went far beyond the bottle itself. Final reflection. So soft closure. That single word, cheers, had transformed from a simple note into a statement of growth, resilience, and quiet victory. And in the end, I realized the sweetest revenge isn't loud or angry. It's knowing you've outgrown the people who once doubted you and creating a life they can't mock, no matter how hard they try.